Perfect. Perfect.
This is Dean Takahashi. Though his name might not initially ring a bell, you're probably more than familiar with his, let's say, hit-or-miss contributions to the video game scene. After pursuing his career in journalism through numerous media outlets, Takahashi would eventually play his hand at video game-related writing, releasing 2 books about Microsoft's Xbox and Xbox 360, which both garnered high praise from critics, thus cementing himself as a notable figure in video game journalism. However, Takahashi's immense praise would soon devolve into heated ridicule, because while he was admittedly great at writing about the history of video game consoles, well, 2 of them at least, actually playing the games themselves would prove to be his Achilles heel. While he's mostly known for being the journalist that was so excruciatingly abysmal at Cuphead that he could barely manage to overcome the tutorial, so much so that a literal 5-year-old had somehow wiped the floor with him, his first true disastrous moment in video game journalism came in the form of his review for 2007's Mass Effect, in which he titled his review Mass Defect. And why, you may ask? Because he didn't understand how the game worked, and trust me, that's not a hyperbolic statement. He makes these erroneous claims about combat, such as stating that when you're shooting at an enemy, an orange box appears on them, and that orange box is the only place that you can inflict damage.
It's false.
You can damage enemies by shooting other parts of the body as well. Then, in this same review, he reveals that it took him 3 hours straight to overcome a particular segment that, by most, is considered a relatively easy part of the game. And as the cherry on top of the cake, in the final paragraph of his review, he states that he never actually finished the game, because, and I quote, "There is no excuse for this. I blame the game developers who put me in this losing decision." This review was, understandably, heavily criticized by most, if not all, players, but thankfully, Takahashi later retracted his review and had a more positive consensus on the game once he figured out how to use skill points. No, that's not a joke. He actually admitted this and apologized for his botched review. So lesson learned, right? Well, no, because he would later go under fire for describing Warhammer 40,000 as a poor man's Gears of War, but that's a video for another day. This is what I'm talking about today, some of the most laughably atrocious and downright awful video game reviews in internet history. Enjoy! Alright, so let's kick things off by talking about one of the most notorious names in video game journalism, IGN. There was a point in time when IGN wasn't necessarily respected, but at least tolerated to a degree. But even in their glory days, and I'm being quite charitable when I say that, IGN was no stranger to derision and contempt. Case in point, their notorious review of the 2006 cult classic, Godhand. Godhand is one of the most unabashedly over-the-top and stylish beat-em-ups I've ever played. It's about as subtle as an M16 in a symphony orchestra, and more often than not, cranks the absurdity factor up to 11. And I mean that in the best possible way. For many, Godhand is the apex of the beat-em-up genre, and for some, it's one of the greatest games ever produced. However, Godhand is not a game for everyone. It's unapologetically goofy and nonsensical, to the point where I'd rather tell my girlfriend that I'm watching an adult film because it's easier to explain in the heat of the moment.
It's strong, but it's a pain in the ass. You should try it for a while.
Let's axe it.
Nice one.
Its controls can take a while to acclimate to, and most importantly, it's an incredibly unforgiving and difficult experience through and through. Keep this in mind, you'll be hearing about difficulty a myriad of times throughout the video. Unfortunately, Godhand's arduous difficulty and steep learning curve was a bit too much for one ill-prepared IGN reviewer named Chris Roper, which consequently led to one of the outlet's most unanimously despised reviews of all time. Chris didn't just harshly review the game, oh no. He fucking eviscerated it, doused it in gasoline, sent it careening into an active volcano, and then pissed on any leftover remnants for good measure, awarding this game a measly 3 points out of 10. That is an absolutely horrendous score, especially by IGN's standards, given how lenient most of their reviews tend to be. Seeing a modern IGN review with a score lower than a 6 is like watching a Tarantino movie without gratuitous displays of feet. However, upon examining the review, you begin to uncover a litany of issues and inconsistencies that lead to one glaringly evident conclusion. Chris didn't know how to play Godhand and placed blame on the game for his inadequacies. Hopefully you don't become a lawyer, Chris. The whole, "it wasn't my client who committed homicide, it was the pistol" excuse isn't exactly the most cogent legal defense. For starters, Chris negatively critiques the combat system and rather erroneously states that it boils down to nothing more than mindless button mashing. Firstly, if you've ever played Godhand, you'll know that button mashing, while definitely a factor that comes into play during combat, is far from the only tool in your arsenal to use against enemies. You have an eclectic array of attacks that you can freely equip equip whenever you want, with more than a few of them having different use cases. Some of them send enemies flying at speeds of Mach 10, others can break an enemy's defense, and some can propel enemies into the air in order for you to continue a combo. That's not even mentioning the other mechanics, such as the roulette wheel attacks, which essentially serve as cinematic special attacks for you to demolish your enemies. So to say that the combat is almost nothing more than mindlessly mashing the attack button is extremely disingenuous. But don't just take my word for it, because Chris directly contradicts himself on his initial opinion 3 separate times throughout the review. Firstly, he mentions the fact that Godhand allows you to customize and swap out individual moves, which, mind you, is stated immediately before his negative critique of the combat. The thing is, when you swap out moves, the game tells you exactly what those types of moves are used for, so it's not just a matter of mashing the button, waiting for an opportune time, and then rinsing and repeating. There's actually a fair bit of complexity and nuance to Godhand's combat. Secondly, he then mentions the roulette wheel attacks, which he describes as nothing more than eye candy. But last time I checked, performing a simple 3-hit combo does a quarter of the damage that an explosive baseball toss does. Plus, there are other roulette attacks that inflict different effects, like the one that sees you delivering a swift kick to the groin and leaving an enemy in a dazed state, and consequently leaving them open for attacks. This one in particular hits a bit too close to home for me. I've fallen victim to so many kicks to the groin in middle school, I wouldn't be surprised if my kids came out cross-eyed. And lastly, he states that the enemies in the game are painfully generic, which I would assume was stated to reinforce his point about the combat being generic, and to that I say, what the fuck are you talking about? Sure, in the first level, the enemies aren't exactly unique from a design standpoint, but they certainly don't feel generic to take on in battle. There are 3 different variants of, quote, generic enemies here. You got the basic grunts that go down quicker than me after 2 Modelos. Yes, I'm a lightweight, sue me. IGN is the same way, except instead of alcohol, it's any difficulty higher than hey, not too rough. You've got the slightly larger enemies that tend to block more attacks and usually only succumb to the heavy hitting attacks, and then you have the average American waistline in the year 2056. But on top of that, you'll later go toe-to-toe with enemies who drop bombs that you either avoid or kick in their general direction, erotic women with whips, and hell, that's not even factoring in the boss battles.
Together we are the
Plus, there are demons that'll sporadically burst from the corpses of defeated enemies, granting you handy rewards if you can manage to defeat them. So how in the hell could you classify that as generic? But also, speaking of those aforementioned demons, Chris also complains about how these demons serve as nothing more than roadblocks that'll occasionally cause you to throw your controller across the room in a fit of rage. Yeah, that's not true either. Yes, they can be difficult, but there are more than a few instances where you can simply walk past them and advance to the next area. And if you thought Chris was done bitching about game mechanics, then get a load of this. He complains about the fact that health doesn't carry across levels. Okay, I think that's actually a reasonable critique for once. But then he also complains about the fact that you regain full health when you die because there aren't any consequences to dying. You can't make this shit up. It's also blatantly false, by the way, as you gain less money the more times you die, and as a bonus, if you're hit enough times, your character can actually level down, so it encourages adept gameplay. So with all of his critiques in mind, it leads me to believe that Chris didn't know how to play Godhand, didn't pay even a modicum of attention to the tutorial, and while this one is more conjectural, probably didn't even make it past the second stage before calling it quits and typing up a half-assed review in order to get his paycheck. Needless to say, this review was absolutely incinerated by the gaming community, and many people believe that this very review led to Godhand's average sales figures and the closure of Clover Studios. I wouldn't say that this review single-handedly put Clover Studios 6 feet under, but I wouldn't be surprised if it played somewhat of a role, given that review outlets held a bit more stake in the game back in the day. It was such a reviled review that IGN themselves would make an entire video dedicated to defending Godhand, and essentially retracting its original review. But to this day, that 3 out of 10 score lives in infamy as one of IGN's earliest controversies. Alright, it's time for round 2 of the IGN humiliation ritual, because we're not done with these guys just yet. This is Dead Cells. It's a game that I'm admittedly not the most well-informed of, mainly because I simply haven't played it, but it just doesn't really look like my cup of tea personally, but maybe I'll take a crack at it someday. So why am I talking about a review of this game when I haven't even played it? Well, it's not because I fundamentally disagree with the reviewer's consensus, it's more so because the reviewer in question couldn't even muster up an original review to begin with. Oh yeah, that's right, an IGN reviewer committed the sleazy and creatively bankrupt act of plagiarism. See, in 2017, a reviewer at IGN named Philippe Musin, I think that's how you say it, uploaded his review of Dead Cells. He ended up scoring the game with an excellent 9 out of 10, and for once, gamers agreed with the score. And for a brief, fleeting moment, IGN wasn't a nuisance in the public eye. So that means everybody sang Kumbaya at the campfire and gave IGN a convivial group hug and solidarity, right? Wrong. Absolutely fucking not. Not too long after the original review was posted, a channel known as Boomstick Gaming had uploaded a video claiming that the aforementioned aforementioned IGN reviewer had copied his review of the game and then modified some of the wording to make it at least marginally distinct from the original. And well, to say that it bore a few striking similarities to the original would be a massive understatement. At first, the review kicks things off in a relatively strong fashion. Hell, when I first saw this video, I just figured that maybe there were only a handful of questionable coincidences, but nothing too egregious. However, the further you dive into the review, the more blatantly obvious the similarities become.
Combat system is fast, fluid, responsive, and one of the most rewarding representations of 2D combat of the entire genre.
Fights are fast, fluid, responsive, and hands down one of the most gratifying representations of video game combat I've ever experienced.
Needless to say, audiences were outraged, especially since Boomstick Gaming had a mere fraction of the subscriber base that he does now. For reference, his video had received roughly 14,000 views, while IGN's review had already garnered roughly 70,000 views. Shortly after this was discovered, IGN terminated Philippe, redacted the original review, replaced it with a different review covered by another employee, and issued a series of apologies and statements to Boomstick Gaming. Hell, in the revised review, you can still find a statement that references the controversy at the bottom of the page. A little while after this disastrous ordeal took place, Philippe would return to YouTube and make a half-hearted attempt at clearing his name by stating that the similarities between him and Boomstick Gaming were purely coincidental and unintentional. But you know damn well that the internet just wasn't gonna buy that excuse. Now maybe, just maybe, Philippe could have salvaged at least a modicum of his career if his disastrous decision was confined exclusively to Dead Cells. But no, it's quite the opposite actually. Not long after this debacle had transpired, it was discovered that Philippe had not only plagiarized work from Boomstick Gaming, but from a myriad of other YouTube channels as well, with two notable examples being Nintendo Wire's Fire Emblem Warriors review and Nintendo Life's FIFA 18 review. This led to IGN reassessing and retroactively deleting every single one of his video game reviews, yet his coverage of Nintendo games and consoles are still left unscathed on the official website. As a final Hail Mary, Philippe would do two things. He would make a post on Reddit admitting his wrongdoing, at least when it came to the Dead Cells review, in order to garner some sympathy and forgiveness. However, he made the catastrophic error of posting to Reddit, one of the most unforgiving and terminally online user bases on the web. Not saying that their reactions were not justified, I'm just giving you some context here. So you can imagine just how spiteful and vitriolic some of the responses were. And roughly a year after the incident took place, he would also upload two official apologies on his YouTube channel, addressing not just Boomstick Gaming's review, but the other reviews as well. This was also not exactly received in the most generous of fashions. Needless to say, Philippe hasn't had the most successful career in game reviews or as a content creator, and considering that we haven't seen a video from him in roughly 3 years, there's a low likelihood that we'll ever hear from him again. Alright, so now we're gonna delve into some touchy territory because we're talking about Hogwarts Legacy. Hogwarts Legacy was, and still is, the definitive Harry Potter game. It has excellent production value, a fantastic soundtrack, an immersive recreation of Hogwarts and the wizarding world in general, not to mention the surprisingly fun and engaging combat system. It is, by all accounts, a must-buy for any self-respecting Harry Potter fan, but even if you're not familiar with the source material, I think you'll still get a kick out of this one. However, Hogwarts Legacy was the focal point of controversy for a handful of people, not because any of the content within the game itself, but more so because the creator of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. Look, I'll be frank with you, I'm not really one to talk about contemporary politics and social topics, so I'll give you the hyper-condensed version. J.K. Rowling expressed her views about a particular group of people, some responded by boycotting the Harry Potter brand, some staunchly supported her, but most were left unaffected, shrugged their shoulders, and continued on with their day. However, once the announcement for Hogwarts Legacy rolled around, the J.K. Rowling controversy was back in full swing, and now people were getting pigeonholed into one of two positions. Were you Team Hogwarts Legacy or were you Team Boycott? It was like the Twilight craze was happening all over again, except I didn't have to choose between a gloomy wolf man dealing with unrequited love or a pale husk role-playing as a vampire who takes 3 business days to initiate a kiss. But for most, there was a third option. If I want the game, I'll buy it, and if I don't want it, I won't buy it. It was the silent majority that I assume helped propel this game's sales figures to over 30 million copies, making it the highest-selling game of 2023. Now, while most critics were largely positive of the game as a whole, there were some that were a bit more critical, and even a small minority of critics who flat out refused to review the game due to the aforementioned controversy. And you know what? I kind of respect that. If you don't want to review it, then you're not obligated to do so, because at least you're not reviewing the game dishonestly. It's a hell of a lot better than what Wired did. Wired gave Hogwarts Legacy an appallingly low 1 out of 10. A 1 out of 10. Now look, you don't have to like Hogwarts Legacy, hell, you don't even have to like games that are considered landmark titles, but there is no way in hell that you could convince me that a game like Hogwarts Legacy is on the same pedestal as something like E.T. for the Atari 2600 or Bubsy 3D or Ninja Bread Man.
What the fuck is this piece of shit.
The reviewer kicks off this review by not even talking about the game. No, instead she delves into her past a bit and recounts the excitement she felt when reading a Harry Potter book for the first time, followed by her stating that she deliberately didn't want to watch anything associated with Hogwarts Legacy, out of fear that she might enjoy it. If this doesn't scream conflict of interest already, then buckle up, because we're just getting started. She then, without any specific examples, states that the game is lifeless, that the world lacks heart or creativity, while also questioning why the game didn't have the John Williams score from the movies. The soundtrack is one of the strongest aspects of Hogwarts Legacy, and it didn't even need to leverage the iconic Harry Potter theme in order to achieve that. Would you not consider that a more creative application of music, rather than lazily rehashing the theme song just for some brownie points? Then she begins to broadly reiterate that the game is lifeless, but then goes on to say that the game looks 2 generations behind? What the fuck are you talking about? Hogwarts Legacy might not be a Red Dead Redemption 2 or Uncharted 4 in terms of art direction, but it's still a damn good looking game all things considered. To say that it's visually unimpressive would be a falsehood of the highest degree. Then she goes on another unrelated tangent about how the Fantastic Beasts movies aren't as well made as the original Harry Potter films, before then brazenly stating that the game's story is packed with anti-Semitic undertones because a game that sees you battling powerful wizards, riding on the back of a griffin, and transforming people into chickens just really gets you itching for a spot in the Third Reich. She even goes so far as to say that buying the game indicates that your goal is to cause harm to someone. Here I was thinking that some of my college classmates were a bit pretentious. One session with the people undergoing a degree in journalism and I'd probably become a raging alcoholic. And I mean, I could delve deeper into this article if I really wanted to, but it's nothing more than obnoxious virtue signaling and dishonest critiques of the game. In other words, very little of this review pertains to the game itself, but is more so centered around the actual controversy of the creator that inspired the game in the first place. And again, you don't have to review this game if you don't want to, but Wired did. With Hogwarts Legacy 2 allegedly in development, it's only a matter of time before we get another one of these absurd articles to groan at. Okay, so to me, one of the most amusing aspects of video game reviews is hindsight. What do I mean when I say this? Well, some reviews expertly pinpoint the moment in which a game becomes a one-of-a-kind achievement in game design. Others might review a game in a more critical light, but will go on to sing the game's praises a handful of years later. And sometimes a reviewer is simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like when Alien Resurrection was criticized by 3 different outlets for introducing a control scheme that almost every single third-person and first-person shooter adopts to this very day. But in some rare instances, the reviewer could just have a perplexing and unorthodox opinion about a game, regardless of what time period you read the review in. Case in point, the next review on this list, Edge Magazine's laughable review of Doom. Doom is arguably one of the most pivotal and influential shooters of all time, and while it wasn't the first FPS on the market, it was the one that almost single-handedly popularized the genre. Now, while Doom was garnering widespread acclaim from critics and general audiences alike, there was one particular review that stood out like a sore thumb, mainly because of how niche and perplexing its main critiques were. Firstly, the reviewer kicks things off by actually praising Doom, more specifically in its technical department. Sure, Doom might seem a bit antiquated in terms of its overall visuals, but for the time, it was pushing the boundaries of PCs across the market, and arguably still holds up really well to this day. The reviewer expresses that Edge Magazine won't, and I quote, mindlessly praise Doom beyond its worth, in such a needlessly condescending tone, as if Doom is nothing more than the feeble peasant struggling underneath Edge Magazine's shoe. Then the reviewer becomes even more unbearable, as the reviewer describes minor nitpicks as if they single-handedly hindered his enjoyment of the game. He criticizes the fact that you can't look up and down, and, get this, also states that the game is too repetitive. Why? Because all you do in Doom, a first-person shooter, is shoot and kill enemies. Firstly, this is a blatantly false statement, as you actually spend a good bulk of the game not just shooting enemies, but also scrounging the area for keys, finding hidden locations, managing your health, your armor, your ammunition, not to mention the handful of power-ups that you can obtain and utilize to your advantage. And secondly, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's a first-person shooter. Shooting is the fundamental bread and butter of the gameplay. That's like criticizing the gameplay loop of Super Mario Bros. Because you spend a bulk of your time running and jumping, and you can't steal a car, pick up Toadette, and then put a cap in her after paying top dollar for her pleasantries. Then, later on down the line, he, for some inexplicable reason, states that the lighting in particular is scary, but the so-called limited number of enemies is an impediment to the game's potential, because it should have tapped more into the horror aspect. Because when I play Doom, I don't play it for the sake of massacring an entire militia's worth of demons, I do it so I can shriek in terror at a bulging pink testicle with teeth, or the aftermath of consuming anything from Taco Bell. Already, this is an obscenely baffling and asinine series of critiques that just make the review feel like it's intentionally going against the grain, for the sake of downplaying the game's success. Trust me though, because there's a reason as to why the reviewer feels this way, because the review culminates in one of the most notorious closing remarks in the history of video game journalism. If only you could talk to the monsters. Oh, well, I don't know. Did you ask Doom Guy what he thinks? Maybe he negotiated a peace treaty, but it didn't work out. Maybe he's a selective mute. Or I don't know, maybe it's because that's not how you play the fucking game. Hilariously, this isn't the only absurd critique in a review from Edge magazine, as they gave Grand Theft Auto 3 an 8 out of 10, which in isolation is a pretty damn good score, albeit a bit controversial given how monumental of a title that game was. The problem? They ticked points off of the very game that revolutionized the modern open world genre for, quote, a lack of freedom. All in all, Edge magazine's Doom review is a catastrophic misunderstanding of what the game is all about, and it just seems like an aggravating series of nitpicks in order to come off as a snide contrarian. Thankfully, Edge magazine has essentially taken this review behind the shed, given it the old Yeller treatment, and now attempts to live in an alternate reality where it never existed, as they eventually went on to rank Doom as one of the top 10 video games of all time. Unfortunately, this is the internet, and the iconic phrase, if only you could talk to the monsters, is still a consistent source of mockery to this very day. Okay, so this next review actually has a bit of a personal connection to me, believe it or not. So back in the not-so-distant year of 2020, aka the year where you couldn't cough in public without nearby pedestrians staring at you like they wanted to hang you in a nearby oak tree, I uploaded a video about a remake of one of my favorite platformers of all time, Spongebob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. That video has aged about as well as curdled milk in the scorching Sahara Desert, but it marks a pivotal point in my channel as it was the very first video that I ever uploaded. In that particular review, I actually critique a couple of other reviews of the same game from different media outlets, and by critique, I mean that I hurl expletives like my life depends on it, while having a vocal delivery that's nothing short of cringe-inducing. You're gonna be doing three things most of the time: breaking shit, bouncing on shit, and buying shit. But if you're GameSpot, there's actually a fourth thing, and that's being shit at platformers. I was going through a video game donkey phase at the time. I don't know why mimicking his voice felt like a smart choice. In hindsight, it sounded like I touched myself every night to the tune of the Godfather soundtrack. I was fucking pumped. In that review, I talk about two reviews, one from IGN and the other from GameSpot. Now, the IGN review does have plenty of flaws, sure, but the GameSpot review takes the cake as one of the all-time worst reviews that I have ever seen for a video game. Why? Simple. The reviewer was awful at the game and gave it a low score to give himself a confidence boost. At least, that's what I think. Remember how earlier I said that difficulty plays a factor in video game review scores? Well, if IGN is the kid that needs a push every time he wants to ride his bike, GameSpot is the middle-aged coward who still uses training wheels to ride a tricycle. For some reason, GameSpot in particular tends to house reviewers that couldn't complete a moderately difficult game if their life depended on it. They gave the Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy a 6 out of 10 while only getting roughly halfway through each of the games. They gave Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze a 6, citing the game's unimaginative level design, which you know damn well is just a covert way of saying that the game is too difficult. And look, I'm no savant of Tropical Freeze, I'll admit that it's a pretty tough game, but there is no way in hell that you're gonna tell me that one of this game's downfalls is its level design. Oh, and let's not even get started on that new Super Mario Bros. Review.
New Super Mario Bros. Wii is a tough game.
And case in point, the review of Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, which GameSpot awarded a 2 out of 10. Just this score alone was enough for die-hard fans of the original game to trash on this review in unison, but I'll tell you, the score itself is the least embarrassing quality of the review. Right from the get-go, the reviewer opens by recounting a puzzle that takes place in the Mermalayer. If you've never played this game, basically, in order to obtain the golden spatula, you have to help guide this boulder through a Rube Goldberg-esque device, and while it's not exactly a cakewalk, you can probably successfully get this spatula on your first or second attempt. For the GameSpot reviewer, however, he describes this puzzle as if it's akin to getting caught in a saw trap, where you have to solve the cure for cancer with nothing but a janky $3 calculator and Breaking Bad Season 2 on Blu-ray. He specifically points out a segment of the puzzle where you have to stand on a switch while using your bowling ball technique to hit a button. However, if you step off of the switch, the gate that reveals the button will immediately shut. This is arguably one of the more rudimentary steps to the puzzle, but for the GameSpot reviewer, this was his kryptonite for some reason, as he slides off of the switch while executing the bowling move, thus preventing the ball from colliding with the button. Now, using your cognitive capabilities for a moment, let me ask you, what do you do in this instance? If you said, step towards the back of the switch so that you don't slip off of it while using the bowling ball, congratulations, you're at least ranked in the mildly competent at video games tier. It's right above kindergartner and roughly 3 tiers above GameSpot journalist. Yes, the reviewer repeatedly steps on the exact same spot on the switch, tosses the bowling ball from the exact same angle, and erroneously believes that the game is at fault. And this is just the opening segment of the the review. He later goes on to state that golden spatulas, this game's equivalent to Power Stars, for reference, are either freely bestowed upon you for little to no work at all, or are obscured by bad camera angles and, get this, unexplained systems that you're somehow expected to know. He doesn't elaborate on this, but if I had to take a stab in the dark, I'd say that he knowingly avoided the tutorial signs peppered throughout the first level in order to churn out the review as quickly as possible, and labeled the game as confusing because he deliberately ignored the resources that the game was trying to give him. That's like complaining about a restaurant lacking vegan options when the signage on the front door, as well as the menu and interior, explicitly inform you that you're dining at a steakhouse. And right after that, he immediately self-reports by stating that the online guides helped assist him throughout the game. Look, buddy, if you need online guides to get past the basic levels of a Spongebob game, then you'll need a whole fucking support group and years of extensive counseling before whittling the Soldier of Godric down to half health. And he's a tutorial boss. Then he complains about the platforming being too unfair. And look, if we're talking about the SpongeBob's dream level, maybe you'd have a half-decent argument. That level's a bigger pain in the ass than the aftermath of insulting Vlad the Impaler during his prime. But this guy's referring to instances in which enemies are placed on platforms that you're about to land on, which isn't exactly a rarity in platformers. Plus, it's not like the enemies are composed of complex, multi-layered artificial intelligence that detects your every move 3 months in advance. They unintentionally warn you when they see you and when they're about to strike. It's not rocket science. Then he complains about the general gameplay and dislikes the fact that you can't dodge enemies in the heat of battle or switch characters on the fly. First off, it's not like dodging is a popular staple of 3D platformers. Most of the time, it largely consists of running, jumping, and maybe getting a dedicated attack button. And secondly, something that the reviewer doesn't recognize is that the game wasn't designed for characters to be switched at any given moment. A majority of the time, you'll be playing as SpongeBob, with roughly 25% of that time dedicated to playing as either Sandy or Patrick. Mind you, each of these characters have abilities that wildly vary from one another, meaning that in some instances, it would be damn near impossible or just too easy for one character to effectively explore an area. And it gets even worse, because he complains that you have to trudge all the way back to the bus stop as if they're these far-flung and sparse locations. The game literally provides you with these in a way that doesn't force you to backtrack. That's not even mentioning the contradictions. He complains about the game warping you to the nearest checkpoint whenever you die, and then complains about the difficulty being too excruciating. But then in the next paragraph, he talks about how the boss battles were a highlight of the game because they forced him to snap out of autopilot mode and actually pay attention. If you were playing the game on autopilot mode, then the implication is that the game is mind-numbingly simple and a breeze to get through. You mean to tell me that you were gliding through this game hassle-free while getting mollywopped by basic enemy AI and short-circuiting your brain while trying to toss a bowling ball at a button that's less than 5 feet away? Okay, sure, get on your high horse. I'm sure your wall is flooded with participatory blue ribbons and handwritten messages that say you tried your hardest. Needless to say, this review was loathed and mocked by players all across the gaming spectrum. Thankfully, the harsh score didn't impact the game too negatively, as it sold over 1 million copies and was followed up by a spiritual successor, SpongeBob SquarePants: The Cosmic Shake. And lastly, we're taking a jab at IGN one more time and looking at their now infamous review of Alien Isolation. So fun fact about me, my all-time favorite horror movie has to go to 1979's Alien. It is a masterclass of horror and science fiction, has one of the best alien designs in cinematic history, has a superlative sense of tension and dread, and some of cinema's most strikingly gorgeous cinematography. Which I find kind of funny because this is the same movie where you see a poor crew member succumb to the 5-point palm exploding heart technique, courtesy of the xenomorph erupting from his chest cavity. But what I'm trying to say is that this film is a masterpiece from beginning to end, and its success would naturally lead to sequels, merchandise, and most importantly in the context of this video, video games. For years, however, the Alien series seemed to get the short end of the stick when it came to proper video game releases, albeit with a few solid exceptions. However, all of that would eventually change when 2014 came around and blessed the world with what many fans considered to be the pinnacle of Alien video games, Alien Isolation. Jesus Christ, this game is quite possibly one of the most tense, foreboding, and nerve-wracking experiences that I have ever played. First time I played this game, I ended up with a bigger lump in my trousers than the time 16-year-old me cracked open an issue of Sports Illustrated. Plot twist, I shit myself both times. Now, despite the immense praise that Isolation received, there were two video game outlets that gave the game less than glowing praise. And you already know damn well it was IGN and GameSpot that were getting pelted with backlash. In a miraculous turn of events, however, it was IGN that came out on top as the more despised of the two. Why is this? Well, because the reviewer gave the game a 5.9 out of 10. This was back when IGN was awarding scores with arbitrary decimal numbers for some reason. reason. Yeah, removing that was probably one of the better decisions they could have made aside from firing a plagiarist. Now, the first half of the review is largely positive, praising the game's ominous atmosphere, the faithfulness to the source material, and of course the highly advanced and terrifyingly unpredictable AI of the Xenomorph. Well, to an extent, more on that a little later. So what happened? Well, for starters, he makes a peculiar nitpick about the game's pacing, stating that it takes a bit longer than expected for the alien to show up and cause trouble. Granted, he does follow this up by stating that it didn't alter his overall opinion, because the game needs time to build up characters, setting, you get the gist. But in a way, that's kind of a perfect introduction to an alien game, considering that the movie progresses in a largely homogeneous fashion. You set up the film, it gets into the characters, and then you eventually toss in the Xenomorph to integrate some tension. It's a small nitpick, I know, but it's something I wanted to point out. I'll let it slide for now. Then the reviewer continues to hammer on the praises, stating that the game hits its apex once the Xenomorph comes into the picture. He talks about the incredible sound design, the intense hide-and-seek gameplay with the Xenomorph, the list goes on. Okay, now we're talking. But then, right out of the blue, the review begins to shift towards a more critical and sour tone, as the reviewer makes a fairly harsh analogy to the campaign structure by likening it to the doomed ship that the game takes place on. Firstly, he talks about the middle section of the game where you're forced into defending yourself against androids known as Working Joes, as opposed to scurrying away from the Xenomorph. Now, honestly, I have to disagree with this point, as I actually found the Working Joes to be disturbing and unsettling in their own right. Sure, they're far less resilient than the almighty Xenomorph, but it's not like they're pushovers. The reviewer then complains about the game trying to be a first-person shooter when it's not. The fact of the matter is that you're given weapons that, for the most part, affect the Xenomorph about as much as a flirtatious smack on the arm, except instead of ending with a kiss on the cheek or a one-night stand, you're met with head trauma that somehow surpasses the destructive force of a migraine. If you weren't able to use those weapons on enemies that could actually be negatively impacted, I'd argue that, with the exception of the flamethrower, the inclusion of weapons would be asinine and completely fruitless. However, as the review continues, you begin to notice some questionable critiques, to say the least. For example, he notes that the fear he experienced quickly turned into frustration after the Xenomorph discovered him while he was stealthily hidden away in an air duct. Okay, sure, I'll give you that. However, while watching the footage, you can clearly see that the reviewer has his motion detector enabled, which, if you didn't know, emits a sound that can actually attract the Xenomorph if it's nearby, unveiling that the reviewer was complaining over an issue that he himself was the sole cause of. Oh, and remember earlier when he was praising how unpredictable and spine-tingling the Xenomorph was? Well, throw that out the goddamn window, because the reviewer decides that the difficulty of contending with the Xenomorph is just too daunting and difficult. And to that I say, have you ever seen Alien? The point of isolation is that it essentially grants the player the opposite of a power fantasy and lets you quake in the boots of someone trying to escape the clutches of an apex otherworldly predator. It emphasizes the survival aspect of a survival horror game and damn near perfectly encapsulates the terror of the first movie to a T. The Xenomorph is supposed to be this daunting and damn near indestructible force of nature. Hell, in the final verdict, he actually deducts points due to how difficult and adept the Xenomorph AI is at tracking down the player. And look, I get it. Kirby's Dream Land, this game is not. It's a grueling, unflinchingly brutal, intense experience throughout, but the overwhelming difficulty just works so flawlessly because it's an Alien game. If this anemic, gangly-armed extraterrestrial bulldog wasn't intimidating in the slightest, the game wouldn't be nearly as compelling as it is. What I also find so odd about this review is that early on he mentions that the game is a substantial improvement over the notoriously flawed Aliens Colonial Marines, a game that, by virtue of a typo in the game's code, caused Xenomorphs to exhibit about as much intimidation and lethality as me in a vibrant pink jumpsuit with a single-shot Nerf gun. It doesn't help that I'm roughly 5'4" to 5'6", depending on whether or not I'm using my tiptoes or wearing boots. So in that case, why did IGN give Colonial Marines a 5 while Isolation was given a 5.9? There is no way on God's green earth that you can convince me that Alien Isolation, arguably one of the greatest horror games ever conceived, is only marginally better than this absolute clusterfuck. All in all, this review sent shockwaves throughout the community, and some people even reported that they initially refrained from playing Isolation because of this review, only to become pleasantly surprised at just how incredible the game truly was when they finally got their hands on it. Thankfully, Alien Isolation has received nothing but immense praise over the years, with many deeming it as one of the greatest survival horror games ever made, and some even referring to it as one of the greatest video games ever made at point blank period. In October of 2024, it was announced that the game would finally be receiving a long-awaited sequel, and it's only a matter of time before we get to screech down the hallways of a doomed space vessel while scrambling to outrun a Xenomorph once more. Hopefully the game outlets are able to step up their game the second time around. Let's check out that GameSpot review. I mean, yeah, it's flawed, but surely it's a bit more reasonable and fair in its critiques.
The game is devoted to door opening, lever pulling, and walking. So very much walking and backtracking. So many old and predictable video game cliches.
Alright, I'm fucking done.